so much for your welcome.
It's always helpful when we have evenings like this if we learn a bit about you. We know there's a story to tell, but it's a good thing if we can learn about you before then. So we've invited you here tonight to talk about coping with loss and the effect it's had on your life. But in the first part of the interview, it will be helpful to learn about Lyn Connolly before she was Lyn Connolly and your early years. So can you tell me a bit about your own upbringing, your mum, dad, where you were born, any brothers and sisters, and where you went to school? So let's start at the beginning. Your upbringing, your mum and dad, tell me about them.
They were lovely, lovely parents, and I was so grateful growing up that they stayed together. They celebrated 60 years of marriage and had the card from the Queen and everything. But also I think it was lovely growing up just in a normal home where my dad went to work, and in those days not every woman worked like they do today. My mum was home, and that was a great blessing to me because my friends in school, a lot of them lived a distance, and they would go home to empty homes. But I always went home to a happy house, and I had a younger brother and an older brother and a sister. So it was quite a busy household as well.
And your brothers and sisters are alive today?
No, I lost my brother 4 years before Paul. Sadly, he was an alcoholic, and he died at 52. So that was heartbreaking as well. But as it is with life, isn't it?
Yes. Where were you actually born, and where did you live when you were growing up?
We lived in Egberth, in Liverpool 17. And I went to the local school, which was St Michael's, and it was just a 10-minute walk from where I lived. And then when I went to secondary school, I went to Dingle Vale, which was 10 minutes the other way. So it was so nice. Like now the kids all go on buses, don't they? And they travel such a long way to school, but it was just everything was local and just nice community feel to where we lived.
And safe.
Yes.
Yeah, which is critical.
Yes. Yeah.
Are your memories of growing up in Liverpool really happy ones, and why?
Well, probably because of the things I've mentioned as well. It was very carefree. You know, I didn't have to worry about anything. My mum and dad just made us feel secure. It wasn't a Christian home as such. My mum and dad believed, but they never went to church. I think they both did when they were younger, but they certainly didn't go. From my memories, they didn't go to church. But it was just a very warm family and lovely to grow up in.
And all your friends and what have you, they were all nearby?
Yes.
And
we lived on a main road, and there were lots of little streets off it. So we all went to school together. Everybody went to school.
You told me that your dad was a huge influence on you, as was your Sunday school teacher, Miss Ellen. Tell me about your dad and why he was such an influence. Tell me about him and then about Miss Ellen.
Yeah, my dad, although he never professed, to be born again, he had some relationship with the Lord. I think because he always went to Sunday school. He talked a lot about them taking him on trips. He went to the Isle of Man and all these things he did with the Sunday school. But the thing that amazed me, even for those days, was that every night he would take us and tuck us in and pray with us, which, looking back, I think was quite amazing at the time. And it was just very simple prayer. It was, I can't even remember it now. It was, thank you for the world so sweet. Thank you for the food we eat. Thank you for the birds that sing. Thank you, God, for everything. And he would say a line, and we just repeat it. And that was it. But it just stayed with me. And it sort of gave me, I would say, my first link with the Lord. because they didn't go to church regularly. That was a
How
very
old,
good
how
link.
old were you then?
Oh, I must have only been 7 or 8, something like that. But he did it for years. He just always came and tucked us in and prayed with us.
And you started going to Sunday school, didn't you? And there was this lady, Miss Ellen.
Miss Ellen. Her name was Ellen Hooligan, which is a very unusual name. So I'm not surprised she didn't want to be Miss Hooligan. So she used to say, just call me Miss Ellen. And so we were very happy with that. And she was brilliant. She worked in St. John's Market in town, in the city centre. And she was on the bacon counter. And she lived with her mum. She never married and she didn't have children, but she considered us her Sunday school class. We were her children, really. So she was like a second mum. And she had a huge influence on me growing up because at the time I didn't know the Lord personally, but I just used to watch the way she lived her life and the way she loved us, and she clearly had a very personal relationship with God. And I was just very influenced by that. And she made me want to become a Christian.
And what age was this around then?
Well, that was sort of 10, 11.
Right.
But I didn't get saved until I was 14.
Okay. Now, Miss Ellen took you, your sister, and 2 friends to hear a WEC missionary, Ken, is it Terhoven?
Yes.
And all 4 of you gave your lives to the Lord. What did you hear that led you to make that decision?
I think, in a sense, I was almost looking for an opportunity to become a Christian. I didn't know how to ask. I was just looking for that opportunity, I think, and it was just the right time for me. And when this man spoke, he told us about his daughter who had been healed by the Lord. And I thought, oh, I didn't realize that God still healed today. I thought that was in the Bible days, where we know that Jesus healed people. But the thought that that happened today, I thought, oh, God's still very much alive then, and Jesus is still so real. And it was that reality when he spoke about the Lord that just, I couldn't wait. At the end when they said, come forward, I was on my feet like a shot. And I couldn't think of any reason why would you not want to know the Lord like that.
And again, what age was that?
So, 14.
14.
Yes.
Wow.
Still at school.
Now that follows on beautifully to the next bit. This bit's really interesting. You met your husband, Mick, when you were both at school.
Yes.
You were engaged at 17, married at 18, and Mick has been a huge influence on your life. Tell me about Mick, and I know he's here tonight.
Yes,
So
I'll be
he's
careful what I say.
No, he's not listening, you're only telling me. Tell me about Mick. Why is he so special?
Well, we've been married 49 years now, and so I think he's a keeper. I think when I first saw him, of course, he was very easy on the eye, and he played the guitar, and so I thought that was a marvellous thing, when he played the guitar, and he was just so cool, I thought. And I think he thought so too, I have to say. He always says I jumped the queue. Anyway. But I think he'd just become a Christian. He was 17, and he'd just become a Christian in completely different circumstances to me. And so we met at a coffee bar. It was called Maranatha in Liverpool 8, in Princes Gate Baptist Church, which is no longer there. It's now a block of flats. But it was just the cellar of this big church where they had this coffee bar, and every Friday they had Christian groups in singing and people giving testimonies. And so I heard about this coffee bar, and because the mission where I was saved was tiny, tiny little mission, would probably fit actually this from there to there. That was the whole church. That was the mission where I was saved. And so I went to help out at the coffee bar, and I met Mick, who gave his testimony. And I was just taken with his wisdom, really, for such a young man. he seemed to know so much more than I did about the Lord and about how the Lord works. And he just had a maturity about him that was rare, I think. He just obviously loved the Lord with all of his heart. And there was a group of us who would meet to pray and have Bible studies. So those friendships grew very quickly. And I think most of us met our partners in that coffee bar, a lot of people. Some even here tonight who I haven't seen for years. It takes me back, to those days.
You have quite an extended family today, with children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. I'll put you on the spot now. Give me a list of your family members today.
Well, I have my daughter, Joanne. Sorry she couldn't be with us tonight. And I just had the 2 children, but I always say I have 2 children, even though Paul isn't with us. We have our daughter, Joanne. We have 2 granddaughters who are 25 and 27 now. And we have 4 great-grandchildren, 1 little girl and 2 boys. One just arrived a week ago, called Zach. He's gorgeous. And it's just wonderful, isn't it, when the family gets extended like that. Yeah.
When I asked you to give me a really happy moment in your life, you said, when I was saved and when Hallie was born. Why Hallie?
Hallie is the little great-granddaughter who came along. After Paul died, of course, it was just such a horrendous time. And then when she was born, it just lifted the family. There's nothing like a new baby, is there, to just keep your mind focused, and just the absolute joy she is to us. I take her to school of a morning and pick her up and things.
How old is she now?
She's 6 now. And we have some great conversations, as you can imagine, with a 6-year-old. But she's just an amazing little girl. And so she always brings a smile to our face. There's some of the things they come out with at that age. She's so funny.
Are you grandma or nanny?
Nana.
Nana?
Yeah.
Lyn, in the second part, we're going to talk about 2002. Forgiveness and hope for the future. Because there's a lot to talk about in the second half, we want to draw this first part to a close now, as our band will now be returning. Tell me about your son, Paul, what he was like, and your memories of him when he was alive. Tell me about Paul.
Very fun-loving. He was always very funny as well. But he was quite shy and sensitive as well, especially around me, I think. I don't know why. He was just very respectful always and very affectionate always. And quite embarrassed sometimes about things. He would play the guitar as well. But if he heard me coming up the stairs, he'd stop singing because he was just embarrassed to sing in front of me. And I often think, I wish I could have just sat and listened to him. He worked very hard with special needs children and adults. And we didn't know till after he died that he was actually supporting a couple of charities, which I don't know how, because he didn't get much money and he was always borrowing off me. So maybe I supported them as well. But he was just beautiful son.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did Paul have a faith in God?
He did. He didn't get on too well with church. He found it very difficult, I think, to fit in. He never felt good enough. I don't know where he got that from. And that's a sadness to think that he felt like that, but he just never ever felt he measured up. And of course, God isn't like that at all. But he used to say to me, me and God are like that. And he did have a close relationship. And some of the stories people told us after he died made me so proud because he never told us the things he'd done to help people, but people were quick to tell us when he died what he'd done for them. And they're the lovely memories.
Was there a girl in his life?
Yes, they were about to be engaged, and the ring was on order. The honeymoon was booked. So we were planning a wedding in our house when this happened.
In the second half, we're also going to cover the importance of family. What does family mean to you?
Family's everything, isn't it? Family are the most important people in the world to you. And I just think now, with only having Joanne here, I feel like, I'd give her the earth, And you just think about the silly things that you withhold sometimes. Like, Paul always wanted a dog. And I just kept saying no all the time. And now I think, why didn't I just let him have a dog, But family are so important. And friends as well.
Lyn, we'll talk some more shortly. I'd like now to pass over to Les. Lyn, in 2002, your life was turned upside down when your 28-year-old son, Paul, was killed in an Anfield street in a motiveless attack by people who were high on drink and drugs and left him bleeding to death. Can you take me through the events of that dreadful day from your perspective?
Yeah, it started off just a normal day, like today. And my little granddaughters were 6 and 8 at the time. And the 6-year-old had been hit by a swing in a park and was in Alderhay Hospital overnight. So I was asked to look after Jenna, who was 8 at the time. And I just really wanted to keep her occupied. She was worried about her sister in hospital. And so I took her to Hunts Cross, which is a big shopping place, and just kept her occupied, really. And then on the way home, funnily enough, it's only when you look back and you remember things. And we were talking about Sally, who was in hospital, and she said to me, Nan, we can trust God for everything, can't we? And I thought, what a lovely thing, for an 8-year-old to say. And it was a really precious conversation, because when I arrived home, I didn't have my door key, and I went round the back of the house and hoping really I'd left something open, because I'd forgotten my door key. And when I walked in, I wasn't expecting Mick to be there. He would have been at the church. But anyway, there was 2 strangers on our settee, a man and a woman, very formally dressed. And as I walked in, these 2 people stood up and took my granddaughter off me and went into the kitchen. And I remember thinking, it wasn't unusual to have people I didn't know in the house. We were quite used to that. But there was an atmosphere, and I wasn't sure what was going on. And I immediately thought about my parents, who were elderly. Anyway, Mick stood up, and when he turned round, I could see that he'd been crying. And so I then began to panic, thinking, and I remember saying, just tell me what's happened. And he told me that Paul had been killed in this knife attack. And as you can imagine, it's just every parent's worst nightmare. It doesn't matter how old our children are. I think when people are elderly or they're sick, you can prepare yourself a bit for that. But this was just a normal day where Paul went to work and never came back. And because he was on nights, I never thought about, him not being there. He wouldn't have been there. But I didn't know what had happened. We didn't know anything about what had happened. But I just knew that our lives would never be the same again.
Lyn, you've said on many occasions since that day that you were required to forgive your son's killers. But what really hurt was that the other parties had a total lack of ability to say sorry. Just explain that to me. First of all, how did forgiveness come about? What was going through your mind? Is this instant, days, weeks afterwards? What led to that?
I didn't really think about forgiveness at all. You know, when your son has just been murdered, who wants to think about forgiveness? You know, it didn't even enter my head, any of that. We were just so taken up with the loss of Paul. As I say, he was about to be engaged, and we were planning this wedding, and I couldn't understand, you know, what had happened or how it had come about. But when the police came and talked to us, they asked us would we do a press conference just the next day. And
the day after it happened?
This is the day after it happened. They said, would we be willing to, you know, for Granada reports, you've seen Granada reports, where people, you know, come and they're asking really for help, for information, to come forward with information to help the police with the inquiries. And we just said, yes, we would do that. You're sort of taken along with everything. You're not really sure what you should do or how you should act or what happens now. You just really go with the flow, you know, just whatever came up. And so the next day we went along to police headquarters in Liverpool. And the police were brilliant. You know, when we went in, they gave us a cup of tea and they took us to the room where the press conference was going to take place. And they explained that the press would come in and ask us questions and just prepared us really for what was to happen. And so Mick and I hadn't really spoken about anything. You know, we were just still numb from the shock. Yeah. So the press came in and they were very respectful and they just very quietly asked us questions. But one man in particular, I'm so glad he asked us this question. He said, how do you feel about the people who've killed your son? And Mick and I just looked at each other and he was waiting for an answer. And we both just said, we forgive them. And that was the moment we forgave. And looking back, I think I could have struggled for years and years with forgiveness, I'm sure. Over the years, we all fall out with people and, you know, you don't speak to people over stupid things. And yet here was this massive thing that had happened. All I can say is the grace of God, and God just intervened in that moment for that man to ask that question. And it really gave us an opportunity. It was a defining moment, really. And we said, we will forgive. And I think sometimes we think forgiveness is this emotion, you know, but it's actually an act of the will. Even though you're broken inside, it's an act of the will, and in spite of everything, we didn't know anything that had happened, we didn't know who had done it, we didn't know anything at this point, but we just knew that we wanted to forgive. You know, that was the moment, I think, when we said we forgive. And I just think of this as God's intervention, really. And I didn't realize at the time how important that was going to be. You know, I always thought with forgiveness, well, isn't that about the other people? You know, they seem to get all the benefits. You know, what benefit is that? You know, if you're the one who's been hurt, and yet they get all that benefit of being set free when you forgive. Yeah. But over the years, of course, I've come to understand forgiveness in a much deeper way. And I realized that actually forgiveness is good for me. And I didn't realize that it's all about, most of it is about how it affects me. Because if you think of unforgiveness, you know, we've met lots of parents who've lost children in the way we have. And, you know, they're isolated, they're depressed, they're very bitter, full of hatred, you know, very hard to be around at times. And of course, we understand all of those things. But I looked at them and I thought, oh, I just couldn't live my life like that. And I was just so glad that I knew the Lord. And I wasn't it wasn't a new concept, forgiveness. We'd, been a Christian, it's actually 53 years I've been a Christian now. And so I've walked and lived with forgiveness in my own life. And but now I knew the real power of forgiveness in such a way that it just felt so healing. And I don't know what came first, the comfort of God or forgiveness, it was all just healing, healing, healing. And for that to happen so quickly, I think that's why we really did well in those early days, because of that.
You've kind of touched on to the next question, but I'd just like you to develop it a bit more. When events like this happen in people's lives, you often hear them say things like, why me? Why us? Or what have we done to deserve this? Did you ever think that? How did you cope with those kind of thoughts?
It wasn't something that really came into my mind about why, because life is life, isn't it? And we lived in a city, and you hear so many things. Yeah. But I just knew that this wasn't some tragic thing that had happened to us. I felt almost immediately that there was something in it that was something that I hadn't grasped yet, but I just felt there was a higher purpose to it. We were asked, obviously when we got the news, we had to go and identify Paul's body. And on the way to the Royal Hospital, where you're shown to a side room, which I visited the Royal loads of times, I never knew that this room at the side was for people like us to go and identify people. And I remember as I walked in, and the Lord spoke to me when I looked at Paul, and we said, yes, it is Paul. I said out loud, I trust you, God. And it was something, it was almost a declaration. I just felt I had to say it out loud because I wanted the Lord to know that I still loved him, that nothing had changed. He knew all of this. It was new to me, but it wasn't to him. And I just felt immediately at that time when we were identifying the body was the time when I thought, there's something more in this. It can't just be this. No. And over the years, 17 years on, it's been an amazing journey.
Who is the stronger, you or Mick?
We take it in turns, I think. It's like when the Lord sent them out 2 by 2, for when one falls, the other one's there to help. And it's been a bit like that. There are times when Mick hasn't been able to cope, and I've been able to, and vice versa when I haven't been able to cope. And we've just helped each other, and there were other things that we had to do, and I didn't feel strong enough to tell his girlfriend. She was actually in Ecuador at the time on a Christian mission, and she didn't know anything about it, and we couldn't tell her because she was so far away. And so my daughter Joanne, she went, the police were really brilliant. They arranged actually a room in the airport with tea and coffee where Joanne could take her to break the news over Paul. So, we've all been strong at different points, but the Lord has just, I can't tell you about the grace of God, the grace of God. I felt like I was just saved all over again. I was learning again those things right from the beginning, just trusting and following him. The first thing I did was to go upstairs when I heard the news, and just on my knees I just said, Father, they've killed my son and I don't know what to do. And it was just, will you trust me? Very simply, he just said, will you trust me? So I knew that there was a plan. I knew that there was something more. This wasn't just this tragic death of our son, but there had to be more to it, because we're the Lord's people. Things don't just happen to us, but he's sovereign and he's Lord of our lives.
Can I talk to you about pain getting easier or not as years go on? Our previous vicar, Graham, and his wife, Philippa, they lost their son in a drug-related incident in Hong Kong some years ago now, when their son was in his early 20s. Philippa wrote a book about her son after his death, and she described her life afterwards as like walking with a permanent limp. Can you relate to that?
I certainly can. I actually met Philippa when I'd done the Echo piece. She also was in some newspaper as well. And I got in touch with her because I knew she was a Christian, and we both were just mums, really, meeting together, who both lost our sons in tragic circumstances. So I did meet Philippa, and she gave me a copy of her book, See You Soon, and it was a great encouragement to both of us to be able to just talk. But as she says, walking with a limp, you feel, when you lose someone, anyone, you feel an emptiness, you feel a part of you is missing. And we certainly felt that with Paul, you know, that I had one son, he was our only son, and now he wasn't with us anymore. And so we will never get over what happened to us, but God has amazed us with the journey through. But, you know, you do feel not quite whole. But in a sense, I remember saying to the Lord, because his comfort has been so amazing, I've said to him, don't heal all of me, because I just enjoyed a new intimacy with God through it. You know, something dreadful happens, it does drive us to our knees, you know, and I just learned to stay and to live so much, it felt nearer to God than ever before. And so although I did have this limp as well, you know, that part of me is still wounded. I didn't want to get healed completely because I didn't want to lose that intimacy that came with grief. And I think, you know, God has given us a healthy way to grieve.
Yeah.
You know, it's not the depression and the isolation, but it's actually coming to him for the comfort that we need. And I need it so much, every minute. You are feeding
So many people here tonight, not just by your story, but by your faith and your obedience and your continuing work. You know, I know I'll say that at the end, but as I'm listening to it, you are a remarkable lady, and God has truly, truly worked within you. It's just a comment, but I think everybody here would say the same thing. It's just incredible. Now, between you and Mick, a book was put together called Son of a Preacher Man. I've got a copy of it here. What is the book about exactly? Why did you decide to write it?
Well, mainly because people over the years have said, you should write a book. But I said, well, I have no idea how. You know, I'm not very academic. I was always average at everything in school, and I didn't have a clue how to write a book. And so I never ever thought about it really. But it's just as our story unfolded, a few reasons really why I wanted to write. The first thing is for a legacy, you know, for when I'm not here.
Yeah.
It's in writing, and
record.
people can read the story. Yeah. But also, I did it with the church in mind, because I think, you know, we're under a lot of attack. You know, we have a lot of difficulties in life. Other nations more than us. But I just thought the church needs encouraging, and they need to know that through the very worst of circumstances, God is faithful. And I remember saying to the Lord, you know, if you can bring me through this, I knew he would, I just didn't know how. But I remember saying, you know, if you can bring me through this, I know I can trust you for anything and everything else in life. And so the aim was really to encourage people that the very worst can happen to us, but we can get through it.
Mick is going to be at the little table we've got as we come in, and there are copies of the book available. I think they're £5, aren't they?
Yeah.
Having had a brief look through it, I really would recommend it's all right. It's what Lyn has said, but it's much, much, much more as well. And there are copies available as you go by the door, plus newspaper cuttings and all kinds of things about the event.
Board.
Yeah. Just to complete the story of what happened to Paul, they got the people who did it, didn't they?
They did, yeah.
And what happened to them?
Well, one of them was, in the end, it was manslaughter, the charge. And I didn't really understand how they got to that, because to me they were both equally responsible, and they, as you say, they were armed with weapons and high on drugs and had been drinking. And the police had said if it wasn't Paul, it would have been somebody else that night. That was just the mood they were in. So to me it was a deliberate act, but it came across in the court as manslaughter. So one of them was charged with that, and he was given 5 years and was out in 3. And the other one was given life, and he had a tariff set of 12 years. And when he came up for parole, as I believe usually happens, he was knocked back. But the following year, he was given parole. And when he came out on a day release, he committed another crime. Don't know what it was. So that set him back again. So I'm not sure whether he's been released now. I don't know about
Doesn't seem
that.
a lot, does it?
Well, when it came across, 5 years, and you're sitting there, and you think...
I've lost him forever.
They didn't know, nobody in the courtroom knew Paul, but everybody else is talking about him. And as his mum, we didn't have a voice. We weren't allowed to say anything. So we were asked to do a letter, an impact statement, which they may use or may not use. So I don't know whether they used it just to say, the effect that crime had had on us.
Now today, you're involved in prison help and support work. Tell me a bit about what you do and how you try to help offenders. And why did you get involved with this kind of work in the first place?
It was the furthest thing from my mind. Never been involved with police or prisons or anything like that. And I heard about something in Crosby, in Kingsway Fellowship in Crosby, called Impact on Crime. And because of what had just happened to us, I went along to that meeting, feeling that there might be something there that had to do with me. And the various police were there and officials, and it was the start of something called Impact, which stands for In Merseyside, Police and Church Together. And I thought, this is where we're up to. We've just had this happen in our lives. And I became a prayer coordinator with the police. But it was 4 years after that when I was asked by a lady, it's actually the funeral of her husband, and her name was Jean Hughes, and her husband Tom had just died. And I went along because she was on our mailing list, that church, and I went along to the funeral, and she introduced me to somebody called Chris Tierney from Prison Fellowship. And I thought, isn't that amazing? At her husband's funeral, she was still thinking of others. And she introduced me to Chris, and he was involved with Prison Fellowship, and he knew our story, and he asked, would I go along to Walton Prison in Liverpool to share my story with the men in Walton Prison. And so I said yes, thinking this is a one-off. I just thought, well, I'll do it once and just, let's see how it goes. And then when the time came nearer, I began to feel sorry that I'd said yes, because it began to feel like meeting the people who killed Paul. I just thought, I don't know whether I can do this. But anyway, I decided, I would just pray about it and see how it worked out. And then on the Sunday, our worship leader was singing a song. And then out of nowhere, they didn't know anything about this. He said, and who knows, God may send you into prisons to set the captives free. And of course, I'm startled because I'd just been saying to the Lord, will you please just change my heart? Because I don't feel, up to it, really. But when he said that, it began to feel like God was sending me. And so I began then to prepare myself and just to go in to share our story. And I went on my own. Mick was still pastoring at the time. He was pastor of a church. And so I went, and I remember on the way, there's a terrible 10-minute walk up the road to get to the gate. And I was just sobbing, all the way there. I just thought, I'm going to be a wreck by the time I get there. But when I went in, I met the team from Prison Fellowship who were going to be on this course. And it was a restorative justice course, which meant nothing to me, but it's all about restoring people, offenders, victims, and community, because crime affects everyone. And so it's a 6-week course. And on week 3, they invite a victim of crime into the prison to share their story. So that was the reason I was there. And so when we got up to the chapel where the course was being held, I just remember thinking, I couldn't stop the tears. And I just thought, what on earth am I doing here? And the men began to come in, and one of them scowled as he came in, and he looked like he was still on drugs. He just had these dark eyes, and he looked empty, like an empty shell. And it came time for me to share my story. It was just very informal. They just sat in a semicircle, and some of them sat cross-legged on the floor. And I just sobbed my way all the way through my story. And I felt that there were things that I needed to talk about, but I didn't know who with, because I didn't want to upset friends or family. But I really needed to talk about what had happened in detail, and I left no detail out. And I just began to offload on them, really. And they just sat and listened, and you could hear a pin drop, and I just thought, this is amazing. I thought they'd swear. I thought they'd be not interested, but they just listened, and a few of them were sort of wiping their eyes a bit, and some of them were looking down, didn't want to look me in the eye. But I felt so relaxed with them. I just felt I could say anything I want to these people, because they were broken and I was broken, and we had quite a lot in common. And I just began to tell them what had happened. And they just listened to my pain. And then I was able to share, because we were asked to share on this course, how did you cope? And it was just, I could share the gospel freely. And so I began to tell them about the Lord. And an amazing thing happened. God just gave me such a love for these men. And I found out later that they were all from the Lifer unit. They'd all taken lives, some of them more than one. But somehow I could just see past that. I just saw, when I looked out, broken people. And I just felt a real love for them. And just, I wanted to bring hope to them, because I was able to share how the Lord had helped us and how he was still helping us to bring us through what had happened to us. And so we all needed hope. We all need hope, don't we, when things happen? You may be sitting there tonight thinking you're in a hopeless situation, but there's always hope. And these people were desperate just for kind words. I think, one of them said afterwards, you're the only person who's ever said a kind word to me in my life. And things that we take for granted, you couldn't take for granted here with these people, you know, and they were just so loving, and I got hugged to death. And they said, we're so sorry. So even though the people who killed Paul hadn't said sorry, these people were saying sorry, and it brought back a lot of painful things for them. But I said to them, God wants to highlight these things because he wants to bring healing. And afterwards, one young man said to me, you know, if I'd heard your story years ago, I would never have reoffended. And you just think to yourself, if there's a way of reducing crime, it's the gospel. Because if somebody who burgles gets saved, he doesn't burgle anymore. Yeah. You know, but they were just so open, and I thought I have never enjoyed sharing the gospel so much in all of my life, because it was like the right moment, the right time, just for them to hear. So we sort of disarmed each other, really, because they thought as a victim of crime, I was going to come in and shout at them and be angry. And I wasn't. I was just this broken person, but talking about the love of God helping me. So it was a really powerful exchange.
You've been doing that ever since then, haven't you?
We've been doing it for 14 years now.
14 years going into prisons, incredible.
26 different prisons over and over.
Lyn, as ever, time beats us, and, you know, I could listen, I know they could listen to you much more, but I want to come to a final question. There will be people here tonight who may have faced really tough issues in life, or even facing them right now. What, from your experience, would you say to people about holding on to the love of God when times get tough?
Trust. It is all about trust. And just be yourself as well. I think, can I read a verse of scripture?
Yes, of course.
There's just one verse which has helped me a great deal over the years. And it's from Hebrews. And you'll probably remember it well. Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. And that word boldly means to come unreserved. You know, you don't have to guard your words with the Lord. And it was such a relief that I didn't have to think or explain or anything like that. I could just be myself with him. And I think if we can just relax in God's presence, bring everything into the light and just talk to him. And that word obtain means stay. Just stay in God's presence and don't move until we receive the help that we need. That's been the biggest thing, I think. It's all based on our relationship with the Lord, isn't it? And, you know, maybe you don't know the Lord tonight in a real way, but you can do. And we've met so many people over the years who have come back to the Lord or given their lives to the Lord, and he's changed their lives as he changed mine those many years ago. But it is just trusting him, because God knows what he's doing.
Lyn, it's been a privilege and an honour to sit here and talk to you and ask you these questions. I felt when we spoke on the phone that I'd known you for a long time. We got on well on the phone, but that was nothing to sharing this tonight. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm sorry for what you've been through, and I can't imagine it. But I tell you what, the Lord has used you in an incredible way. He really has. So on behalf of everybody here, ladies and gentlemen, Lyn Connolly.
Thank you. Thank you very much.